So our first panelist, over on your right, and that was is Michael Frank, and he's the director of the Washington, D.C. Programs and Research, and he is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, and I'll put in brackets, on War, Resolution, and Peace, is what its actual full name is. And he has a JD from Georgetown University and has really serious conservative background. On your left, and that doesn't necessarily, there's nothing indicated in that, is Pia Orenius. She's the vice president and senior economist of the research department at the Federal Reserve Bank in Dallas. She has a PhD from the UCLA. On my left is Riza Ramazani. He is a distinguished graduate from my department. He's a professor of economics at St. Michael's College. And so here he got his MA and PhD from CU. I'm not sure, were you in the Economics Institute?
Yes, I was.
Okay, so he came here probably in the Economics Institute, which some of you who've been around Boulder a long time know about that. And he came from Iran, I believe.
That's correct.
That's right. So we're going to start, and Michael will begin, and he'll give us his thoughts on this topic, and then we'll move next then to Reza, and finally we'll finish up with Pia. Okay? Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon. Great that you're still here, Friday afternoon. We had a panel at 9 a.m. and there were no students in the room, which makes perfect sense after a long weekend. It's at 9 a.m. on a Friday. So I do see some students, I think, here now. So that's now that we're in the afternoon hours, I guess it's okay. Let me take this a little bit from more of a political standpoint and lay out a couple of things that I would expect a Trump nationalist agenda, economic agenda to look like, with the caveat that you have Trump the candidate and you have Trump the president. And it may be that we see two very different types of economic agendas emerging under the president than would have been the case if you had taken some of his actual campaign promises, statements, attitudes, instincts literally and translated those into specific policies. So let's start with one element that I would look at. Trump is a New Yorker like I am, and I heard this voice growing up constantly. I grew up in a working class part of New York, and despite Trump being a billionaire and having grown up with a lot of money through his dad and everything, he's more Queens than he is billionaire in his attitudes and his tone and his kind of brusque nature, the way he approaches things. And I think whether it's an overt or a derivative political goal he'll have, is to try to find ways through his policies as president to pick up a lot of support institutionally, but also at the rank and file level from private sector trade unions. So in other words, the private sector portion of the AFL-CIO, I think politically might be up for grabs over the next 4 years. And if you've noticed that he's had the presidents of these unions come into the White House, I think more than once already, he's making a pitch for them. There's talk of $1 trillion infrastructure bill. That's music to the ears of all these trade unions. He's changing, and through his executive orders, he's undoing some of the regulatory initiatives of President Obama's administration in the areas of energy and environment, for example. That's music to their ears, too. When I was with the House Majority Leader, I was on the receiving end of a lot of the meetings. I was policy director. We had all kinds of meetings with different constituent groups. And these heads of these trade unions would come in and explain where they were so frustrated. And they really didn't like the Affordable Care Act. They really didn't like the utility MAC plan. They really didn't like the Clean Power Plan. And they were laying out all the reasons why, which of the unions would be decimated by it. They wanted the Keystone Pipeline. They wanted more pipelines. They wanted pipeline reforms. You name it. They were adamant about it. But when you asked them if they would do something to try to help us pick up significant support from House Democrats, they really they got quiet all of a sudden. These brusque, large talking Irish guys, and almost every one of these union presidents, by the way, is Irish, suddenly became very quiet and shy. I have a feeling that might start changing when they have a friendly White House, and we'll see what happens. But what that would translate into is a really large infrastructure bill. And the moment you get in that territory and you start bidding up what you're going to be spending that money on, how it's going to be spent, where, what states, which congressional districts, you have the potential for some certain kinds of realignment. Then you come up with the question of pay-fors. How do you not blow $1 trillion additional hole in our debt? And that's going to be a big part of the equation, which gets to the next item, namely, I think the kind of tax reform that a Trump nationalist agenda would lead to would look a lot different than the more ideologically premised ones you've seen in recent years out of Republican leaders, both in Congress and on the campaign trail for president. And by that, I mean there'd be less reluctance to try something, straight out of the School of Supply Side Economics, and more of a willingness to use the tax code to achieve certain social goals. They call it social engineering, in order to accomplish some political ends in the process. So I think the negotiations you'd get on a tax reform will be much more likely to be transactional, with goals in mind that are not necessarily first and foremost making the tax code simple, fair, easy to understand, and so on, guaranteed to get the most growth possible. I think that can become a derivative, secondary, tertiary outcome of those kinds of negotiations. Trade, we can talk a lot about trade, but there's this whole notion of America First puts a lot of trade agreements, a lot of the premises of trade relationships in the crosshairs. We've already seen him walk away from TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, despite his misunderstanding, at least in one of the debates, about the countries that were in or not in the TPP. He incorrectly thought China was part of it, and this is a way to get at China, when in fact all the East Asian nations that we want to have alliances with to counter some of the influence of China in the Pacific, those are the countries in the TPP. So anyway, maybe he'll figure this out at some point, who knows? But I think, obviously, going forward, the whole nature of U.S. engagement on trade is going to be fundamentally different. For example, we might see them open a serious negotiation with the UK as they're exiting the EU. That might give him a chance to be in favor of some kind of trade agreement rather than being against everything. And immigration. That was one of I've had 3 tours of duty on Capitol Hill, and each time it's intersected with some kind of upsurge and work on immigration legislation. Sometimes it reached the president's desk, a couple times, most recently passed the Senate and died in the House where I was working. There, you have this divide. First of all, immigration policy done properly is a great economic tool for the country. Immigrants are disproportionately the developers and the holders of patents. They disproportionately create companies. There's one survey I saw that something like 40% of the Fortune 500 companies were either founded by immigrants or the sons and daughters of immigrants. And in Silicon Valley, there's a similar statistic about how many of the Silicon Valley companies have been founded and run and grown under the leadership of immigrants. So if you do it right, there's all kinds of positive economic benefits that flow from bringing lots of talented and interesting people into this country legally. However, there's another school of thought that gets into how many immigrants a country can receive and somehow retain its identity, its core values. That's a different argument than arguments over the legal immigration or illegal immigration. It's really an argument over numbers. We brought in the most recent year, 1,050,000 immigrants legally. These people argue that number should be significantly lower. That's a whole different argument. Part of the Trump economic agenda might trigger that, and it would be different in kind. There are certain tools available within the flexibility in immigration law that would allow a president, through the Justice Department and the Department of Homeland Security, to ratchet back on some of the category flows of immigration if they want to. Congress probably would have some issues with that, but I think that's a big X factor in how that would play out. But the point being is that that's another big policy area on the table up for grabs that has broad economic consequences under a Trump economic agenda. So I think I'll stop right there. Those are all the things on the I can think of that are on the table. I think as we progress, you guys will come up with more things. I think there's patent reforms, for example, that are moving forward that could have indirect implications on this as well. But on that point, I'll stop and look forward to your questions. Thanks.
So feel free to write out questions. We have some real experts here, so if these are things that are of interest to you and you want things answered, this is really a good place to get answers to your questions regarding Trump's economic policies. Reza?
Good afternoon. Let me start by saying it's always a pleasure to come back home, and I gotta be honest with you, I'm a little bit nervous sitting next to the chair of economics department, and I'm afraid if I don't do a good job, they're going to get my degree away from me, and I'm really, really nervous in this session. So I'm gonna do my best. I hope I don't embarrass the economics department. I really don't like flip-floppers. But I think in the last election, we didn't really have only one. We gotta be fair. In the spirit of fairness, when it comes to flip-flop, I don't think one person has a monopoly. So there was a little bit of competition. However, if somebody want to flip-flop, I like what has happened the past few days or past few weeks in this country when people realize their mistake and say, well, look, I want to change position. I admire those people, be very honest with you. And I think more or less I agree with Michael. I want to look at three specific part of the Trump economic plan. The first part is the stimulus package that he's planning to spend, and I hope he's really going to do what he said during the election. In this particular case, that is going to spend some money on infrastructure, our bridges, our roads, our airports, I think in general transportation, because we see all the challenges we're facing in this country as far as the infrastructure is concerned. And I think that's the type of investment that is going to pay a lot of dividends, is going to reduce unemployment, create decent jobs, and help us to be more efficient as an economy. So I am totally with Donald Trump. Now comes the sad part. However, when I go to conferences and evaluate my colleagues' work, they say, cut all the nonsense, get to the however. That's the most important part of it. Now, this is what I want to say, and it's based on my training at University of Colorado, Economics Department, University of Colorado. I think to me, as a humble economist, economic nationalism is not really an economic theory that explain markets in this global economy. It is instead a political arguments aimed at blaming foreigners for United States problems. And again, I apologize making this statement. On trade, especially, and on immigration, being international economist and being an immigrant myself, I think those are the two areas that is close and personal. I'm very passionate about those subjects. So on trade and immigration, Donald Trump and Steve Bannon have attempted to take the dislike or the resentment of foreigners and craft it into an economic theory that, based on my humble economist, it doesn't make much sense. Michael mentioned about trade. The first thing I teach my student in my international economic course, and hopefully I back it up with facts and not alternative facts, that trade is not zero-sum game. In other words, if we trade with another country, for example, China, not all the gains are going to China and we're going to be a loser. It's going to be win-win for those two participating countries. Now the question is, how do we divide the gain trade? So somebody might get 5%, and one country might get 1%, another one might get 95%. That depends on the trade negotiator, the terms of trade we're going to receive. So there is nothing wrong with the theory of international trade when we say it is a win-win situation. Now, one of the problems I see as a college professor in this country, I cannot really blame the politician. I can blame us as a voter, as a citizen, because we don't have a lot of basic knowledge about economics. We don't know how he works. And when a politician or a charlatan economist like me make a statement, people don't question us. Now, I'm trying to tell my student, people have a right to make the statement, but as a population, as educated people, we gotta ask the hard question. Why? How? What kind of evidence do you have? And I think that's what is lacking, honest to God, in this great country. I expect those things from people or a population in my own country, in Iran or maybe other developing countries, but I'm expecting more for American people. When I'm as an economist in this audience, when I make a nonsense statement, when a politician make a nonsense statement, I like people ask those questions. And again, I'm doing some advertising for institution of higher education like CU and myself. So one way to change, we can't blame the politician. We gotta take some personal responsibility and we gotta make some changes. Now, for example, the politician always concentrate on trade deficit. Trade deficit is a deficit between goods and services we buy from Chinese and goods and services maybe we're selling them. But there is another part of a trade. So the first one, they call it current account, but also is a capital account, the movement of the money and capital that come from China in the United States. So again, I don't see anything if you have a current account deficit of $100. We purchase $100 goods and services with Chinese, but guess what the Chinese are going to do? Is it possible to bring all the $100 and invest it in the United States and create jobs? So I don't see anything wrong with that. So as an honest politician, I gotta tell the truth. I gotta tell American public, this is a good, this is a bad, and this is a ugly side of a trade. Unfortunately, we don't do it. And listen, I'm as bad as everybody else because also as economists probably concentrate on aspect of my economic policy that is going to serve my purpose. So my students should make my life interesting, make my life miserable by asking tough questions. Now, and we talk about, well, a lot of people talk. We got to be fair. Mrs. Clinton made the same statement because that was a popular theme. Use American people fear and look for a scapegoat. So they were saying, look what happened to all the manufacturing in the United States. We lost them because those bad Chinese or bad immigrants. But folks, I have a bad news. Those jobs, we lost 80% of those jobs as a result of automation, as a result of technology. And honest to God, if people deport me to my country, if we stop import for other countries, China, and if that make this country better off, I'll be the first one to get to the airport and take the first flight back to Iran and deal with those crazy mullahs. But I want to tell you, I'm not going to take United. I'm not going to take you. So 85% of a job lost because of automation. So we got to, again, is it, I'm saying let's follow what people are telling us about trade, immigration, but do we have evidence if we follow through, it's going to make a difference? I want to see some evidence. Now, I think you talk about immigration, and I am one of those immigrants. I'm not going to say, oh, I got here, I made it, let's shut the door. But I agree that we cannot have open door policy, accept unlimited number of illegal, and refugee to this country because against my training as an economist. Because the first thing we teach our student is a scarcity, is a limitation. We don't have the resources to take care of those immigrants in a passionate and in the right way, and that, I think, is a reality we have to accept. But at the same time, we've got to be realistic and say, what kind of a role do the immigrant play? There has been a lot of studies, and some of them by reputable institutions. There is, believe it or not, there is the immigration surplus. Yes, the immigration, an immigrant reducing the wages in the short run. But in the long run, folks, there is something, as economists, we call it immigration surplus. What do I mean by immigration surplus? Every year there is it's not a lot of money, but there is a $50 billion contribution by immigrant. Where do we come up with that $50 billion? Now, the immigrant obviously reduced the wages, and I think the wages dropped probably for workers by $500 billion, and that's the problem because the politician economists might concentrate only on the negative effect of immigration. Look what happens, $5 billion reduction in wages. But folks, when wages drop, is it possible the producer, the corporation will benefit from that and become more efficient? So a study at the same time indicate then the corporation, the company save $550 billion. So that's the reason we end up with the $50 billion net surplus or immigration surplus. Now, I understand and I get it. Some people might argue, well, there is a problem here because it's a redistribution of wealth from labor to capital because we are reducing the wages by $500 billion and the profit or the revenue of a corporation goes up by $550 billion. But that story is not completely true because as a corporation, as a producer, I am saving some money. I think American consumers are going to benefit for that because I'm probably not going to raise my prices. And also the study proves and shows that as a result of reduction in prices because of the competition, it's not a huge number, but on average, the income of all Americans increases by 0.5 percentage point. So, again, we've got to look at not the glass half empty all the time. Also, I think, you've got to look at the half full. You've got to look at the balance. What is the positive, negative effect of immigration? So, in order to bring the sermon to end, I want to emphasize that on the spirit of fairness, the administration policy, spending, investing money in infrastructure make absolutely sense, and I'm for it. But when it comes to trade, when also come to immigration, we gotta be fair. We gotta talk about all of these challenges we might face as a result of a trade, as a result of immigration. But also, I think it's important not only for young people, for the student, but also for the population in this country to say, look, these are the positive ones, and that's not only I have to do as a college professor, but all of us in this conference, tell our piece, and then take a few steps back, give the audience, give the student the time and a place to think for themselves and make the decision. Because as someone who grew up in a society that didn't have the freedom of making up his mind, because somebody always told us as young people, this is the way you're supposed to think. You are not I remember when I was growing up in Iran, my parents always told me, you don't discuss any of these issues outside the home. And that causes a lot of problem, maybe damages in the future. I want to conclude with this. This country is a great country. This country has been good to me, and I hope in a very small way I have been good to this country too, and I want to say to young people, you don't know how important it is that you're able to express yourself in the classroom. Even if you're dead wrong, without worrying about disappearing the next day because you said something that might not be appropriate or the government might not like it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm also glad to be here and happy to see everyone out on Good Friday. I'm not sure what this administration's economic policies are, and also I don't want to be political. So I'm going to just try to speak in general terms to the best of my ability for these introductory remarks. I guess picking up on what Riza talked in glowing terms about a future infrastructure spending program. So my first sense of pessimism comes from the fact that how do we fund an infrastructure program if one is coming? So we spend a lot of time, especially, and also the head of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas spends quite a bit of time looking at the national debt, the deficits, unfunded entitlement programs. So the U.S. government is in a fiscal bind, I think, looking forward. The debt is, I think, at a record high if you don't include, the debt in the wake of the Second World War. So debt, I think, is, depending on how you measure it, close to $18 or $19 trillion. We run deficits even in boom years when the economy is growing and doing well. And we have these unfunded entitlement programs, which are unfunded in terms of a net present value of just many trillions of dollars. So looking at the fiscal picture and looking at the desire to cut taxes rather than raise taxes, I don't see how we fund an infrastructure program. That's my first pessimistic remark. My second pessimistic remark is going to be what I perceive to be a change in the rhetoric against openness and economic openness. We know that we do live in one of the richest economies in the world, which has also been one of the most successful economies in the world in terms of productivity growth and innovation. How did we get here? We got here, I would say, in many ways, but trade, openness to the rest of the world in terms of trade and business investment, and immigration has been some key strengths of the U.S. economy. We, through our immigration system, although we complain about it bitterly and often, we've brought in some of the best and brightest from the rest of the world, and it's served us well. If you think of our high-tech industry, it's by far the most innovative in the world, and that's, so much of that has come, as Mike and Riza pointed out, so much of that has come from immigrants that have started companies and invented technologies in the United States. So this has been a huge benefit for us. Openness to trade brings in business investment, makes our industries more competitive, enriches consumers, right? Of course, this doesn't mean that any of these things are costless. There's winners and losers from immigration. There's winners and losers from trade. But as policymakers, I think policymakers are, they are responsible for saying, we know that these things result in net benefits, and we also know that there's winners and losers from these things, from openness, initially at least. And so we can have policies where we have immigration and trade, but we actually recognize who might be a loser from trade, and we compensate that person with training or funds or resources, however we can, in order to make sure that if there's a displaced worker, this worker can retrain and work in another field. So I think that doing the right thing, remaining open to the rest of the world is what policymakers are slated with, that responsibility. My last comment, which is another area I work on at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, I'm in the regional group, but the regional group, fortunately for me, includes Mexico. So we do study Mexico quite closely and follow economic conditions in Mexico. And I'll say, just remind everyone, Mexico is one of our biggest trading partners, certainly after China and Canada. It's Mexico. And in Texas, 40% of our exports go to Mexico. So Mexico is a big trading partner for the United States. And I want to point out that Mexico, trade with Mexico, about half of that trade is intra-industry trade, which means it's actually part of a production chain with U.S. industry. And whether it's auto parts might be the best. The automotive industry relies a lot on Mexican companies to manufacture auto parts. Just to make, the bottom line here is that this trade with Mexico actually makes U.S. industry more competitive. It helps the U.S. export to the rest of the world. And so this is a beneficial relationship. And I think that's also gotten lost in the fray.
Okay, thank you. So now I'd like to give each panelist, we'll go back through, and maybe the things that their co-panelists reflected on, maybe they would have things to add to that. And so we'll go back in the same order.
I want to add one area I didn't mention that might factor into some people's reactions too. When it comes to economics, you don't often think of what we spend on national security as being there, but the Navy is looking at dramatically expanding its fleet, its capacities, especially in its ability to police the sea lanes and so on in the Pacific. And when Pia was talking about the stresses and strains on, you want to get a tax cut, you want to get an infrastructure bill, well, add into that equation several $100 billion over the next 10 years on additional spending for the Navy at a minimum. It might even extend out to the other services. That's your wish list. And the Navy, however you think of it, is essential to guaranteeing that all the trade we have with the Eastern Asian democracies remains free and open and unimpeded. And the building of the islands by the Chinese, for example, is a real threat to the ability of that trade to continue unimpeded. And how Trump reacts to this is anyone's guess, because in one level you have to be really pro-free trade to want to guarantee the sea lanes. The other, and you have to dislike China, which he seems to, maybe today, maybe not as much, but at least yesterday, right? And you have to want to have a robust Navy, which he seems to be, even though he's a bit of a, doesn't want to get involved in too many parts of the world, a la Andrew Jackson, he still wants to have a strong military whenever his honor, or the honor of America, is challenged, right? So I think there's that Jacksonian instinct too that could lead to this, but that desire to put hundreds of billions of dollars into a stronger Navy has to be factored into all these different plus and minuses on the fiscal side.
I might be wrong, and it's not anything new as economists being wrong. I have a little bit problem with the amount of the money we spend on defense in this country, especially these days on a particular type of machinery or airplane. One of them, the best example is F-35, that some of them supposed to be housed in my state. This type of airplane, as a lot of you know, they're extremely expensive. And I don't think is going to be an effective way to protect ourselves against bad people that are trying to harm us. Because this is not the same way this country, or people in this country has been attacked by bad people or bad countries. So I don't know that's the wise investment when we're spending or planning. If you look at the budget proposal, going to be a lot of cut in a lot of areas, and I think most of the increase is going to be in area of defense. So this is a classical example for a student when they came first economic class, the example of guns and butter. So we're spending more money on guns and butter. At the same time, I'm not worried about running a budget deficit, at least in the short run, if we spend our money wisely investing in infrastructure. Because the study indicates that the rate of return on investment in infrastructure is going to be around 20%. Government has two options. We can borrow money as a government, and I think this is a good time to borrow money because the cost of borrowing money is very cheap given the current rate of interest. And if we don't want to borrow, I think there are other ways that we can finance investment in infrastructure. I'm sure a lot of people, including me, I'm willing to pay more taxes and more fees if I know that our airport are much more efficient, especially airport in New York and New Jersey, as some of you know, and especially if you're able to fix some of our bridges that really falling apart, and if you're able to do something to improve the quality of the drinking water in Michigan, which, as a lot of you know, is affecting the IQ of a lot of children. So I think is a right investment. I think if you look at it from social point of view, and also is a good economic investment. So I think we are going to probably be in the good shape as far as the size of a budget deficit is going to be concerned in the long term.
Yes, I think, Riza, you make a good point. I think what people have been talking about in terms of infrastructure spending, and this might take some of the burden off the taxpayer, is these private-public partnerships where private and public come together to fund things like toll roads. That's an example we're familiar with. But certainly the U.S., I think, spends more on national defense than most other countries, and that's where a lot of the funds go. I guess I was, the fiscal situation of the country, it came more clearly to my attention recently because I was on a National Academies panel, and actually, Riza, I think you cited some of the results from the study from the National Academies. Mm-hmm. We were looking at the economic and fiscal impacts of immigration. And so the economic impacts we're pretty familiar with. The fiscal impacts, that was the first really comprehensive updated study that had been done since the mid-1990s. And what was interesting was in comparing the results from the 1997 National Academy study on the fiscal impacts of immigration with the study that we just did, was that how bad the fiscal situation had become, not just for immigrants, but actually for the whole country. And so we hear a lot in rhetoric and so forth in the media, and certainly some coming from the administration about the net fiscal costs of immigrants. But when you sit down and crank the numbers, everyone's a net fiscal cost because of the deficits and the debt. And so that was most shocking to me, is that how much worse fiscally, fiscal shape we are in today than we were 20 years ago, and the implications of that. Because, for example, what it means is that, what's the fiscal impact of one person? It's basically what we contribute in taxes versus what we consume in publicly provided services. Typically, it's going to be education and sometimes healthcare. It depends on your age. But public education, Medicare, if you're elderly, those types of things are the biggest expenses that we generate. But then there's also what we call public goods, which would include national defense. So what happens if you take an immigrant and as soon as he steps or she steps into the country, if you assign them their cost of public goods, which is their share of the national debt, so the interest payments on the national debt and their share of national defense spending, which is another public good, then they're already in the hole. And they're not going to, unless they make very high incomes, they're not going to be net fiscal contributors. And I think, but then when we looked at natives, it was the same situation, just because we have these very large expense items, which are public goods, and then given, like I said, the interest payments on the debt, the spending on national defense, other public goods, expenditures, things that have to be paid, make the fiscal impact of any one person much more negative today than it was 20 years ago.
So on that bright note, so I want to throw out a question to the panel, because we've been talking a lot about infrastructure. So one of the things that's getting floated, and I hear the bond people talk about this a lot, are to use public-private partnerships to do the infrastructure plan, the infrastructure bill, but the way that you're going to pay for those is through resellable tax credits. So that's basically to reduce the government by spending on infrastructure. So the net impact on the budget is neutral, because you're reducing other, the government in all other areas. So I would like the panelists to comment on that.
I think that's an idea coming out of, excuse me, the Cohen in the National Economic Council and some of the Goldman Sachs people who are now working in the White House. It seems to be an answer, and I'm not sure if it's going to be satisfactory, to some of the concerns about blowing a bigger hole in the deficit through just actual government outlays. Department of Transportation gets a big appropriation for highways, and they start allocating large grants to for different projects with maybe some formula of matching or something at the state level. They do that for mass transit. They do that for bridges. They do that for tunnels. They do that for whatever. That's a harder political mountain to scale in this environment, because the deficit, as Pia pointed out, even in a good time, is already very high. It's almost built-in structural now to the annual cash flow. So I'd like to see more about how the numbers would work out, but I can see why it would be gaining some levels of interest, and why it might solve some of the political problems and headaches that any of the leadership would have to encounter when they see the different moving parts of a piece of legislation put in front of them. The final number on deficit increase or decrease is going to be very, very crucial to any kind of infrastructure bill going forward.
I really don't have any problem with the public and private partnership, because I think some of this project obviously really requires, and I think the government by itself doesn't have the skill of implementing, or taking care of some of these projects. So definitely, really, we need the role of the private sector. But a problem I have when the government and private sector work together is a lack of a transparency. I want to make sure, when we work with the Wall Street, the firms or the companies that are getting involved with this public project, they want to do the job as efficiently as possible, and the selection of the companies that are going to be in charge of investing in infrastructure is not based on nepotism and political favoritism. That's my problem.
You're good? Okay. So now we're going to move on to some questions from the floor, unless the panelists want to say anything more. You guys good? Yep. Okay. So I've got them, into categories here. Obviously, a lot of them are where there's interest in trade, and because the one student who submitted one was in that. We're going to talk about trade first. So, question. This is from Nick with a great name. Trump has really offered a trade deal with China for cooperation on North Korea. Any speculation on what that deal might entail, and how does that fit in Trump's America First policy? Anyone?
You guys have any ideas?
I was delighted to hear that China is not currency manipulator. Do you guys remember that during the election? I think he's using his business skill, to get the deal, and I think he's using trade to put a little bit of pressure in North Korea and his leader to behave, and I think he probably realized, and people who are giving advice realize, I think it's much more effective if the pressure comes from China, because China provide a lot of resources to North Korea. Now, North Korea is not afraid if the United States impose an economic boycott because, we don't really do anything with them, But I think, this is the reason he's thinking, so I'm going to make a deal. I want to be nice to China if China return a favor. And I think this is probably a businessman mentality. So I think, and I really don't know. I really don't care. What I'm going to say, I know there are a lot of people say things about Obama, about the president, but for better or worse, he's a president of this country. And I want to say this, and I wish him all the best, and I hope he succeeds, because his success is my success and the success of all Americans. And if he fails, all of us going to pay for our mistakes. So let's hope that he's making the change for better, and he noticed that, look, all the statements he made before election, they are not practical, they are not logical, they are not doable. And I always tell my students, if I may say this, my students, I think same as everybody else, they make a lot of nonsense statements, they make a lot of excuses when they don't do well. And my job as older faculty is to stop them and say, look, you don't make any sense, and I need to challenge you. Why? Because I don't challenge those young people, and they make a lot of nonsense. After repeating it so many times, they believe it as a fact. And I hate to say this. I think that's happened to our current president. Because of his wealth, because of his power, he made a lot of nonsense statements. Nobody had the courage to challenge him. So I think his mind, honest to God, he believes some of this thing. And he thinks he's right. He said, what is wrong with you guys? Why you look at me like that I have 3 heads? I'm telling the truth. So I'd like to give him a benefit of the doubt.
Anyone else want to speak to that?
I'm not sure I want to speak directly to that. I don't really know what this deal is. I just saw the headlines in the paper. But, I think in terms of the things that have to be resolved vis-a-vis China is really not so much sort of the flood of cheap imports, like we said before, that kind of is bolstering consumers in the U.S. There's a lot of benefits to trade with China. But I think what seems to be an outstanding issue, which no one has resolved, is the access that U.S. firms have to doing business inside China. So that seems where a lot of the fairness issues arise, and I think that they seem much more free to invest and do business in the United States than U.S. firms are in China. And so that's sort of, again, I'm not an expert in this area, maybe Riza knows, but that seems like an outstanding issue that should be resolved. I just want to remind everybody, also, I agree that China really hasn't been a currency manipulator. We don't see any evidence of it when we look, and right now they're actually desperately trying to bolster the value of their currency. So I think that ship has kind of sailed, I think, and hasn't been an issue for a while. But just to remind everybody, China actually has a lot of domestic problems. We see China as sort of this huge power in the world, an economic power, and they are obviously a large country, lots of economic power and so forth. But there's so many domestic problems there, and I think that the economists that study China have a fairly pessimistic outlook for China. So their banking sector, for example, is probably in trouble. They have an overvalued real estate market, certainly. Probably a lot of bad loans out there that we don't fully know about. They have a lot of problems with corruption. And they're facing a demographic implosion because of the one-child policy. Even though they've seemed to have relaxed the one-child policy, it's too late. You'll never get back to where you were once you've had that rule in place for several decades, which they had. And so their population is growing much more slowly, and it's just a matter of time before it stabilizes and begins to decline.
If I may add, also they're experiencing major environmental challenges, as some of you know, and also have a major shortage of energy.
Okay, we'll do a couple more on trade. So, question. So it's first a statement and then a question. Trump wants to devalue the dollar because that helps us compete with China. Isn't it bad for our economy, bad for the consumer? How does he have the power to do that?
What the economists do.
I don't think he does. The dollar's value is set in the market. It's the most traded currency in the world, and so it's. I don't think he does. Obviously, and exchange rates are extremely complicated and a function of so many variables. But I will say, for example, what just happened with the Mexican currency. So last year, when there was all this rhetoric around Mexico and unfair trade and NAFTA is a terrible policy and so forth, all this uncertainty that generated in Mexico and among investors that are investing in Mexico and businesses that are in Mexico forced the peso down severely and caused a lot of problems in Mexico in terms of inflation has bounced up as a result of the depreciation of the peso. But with just a little bit more positive rhetoric in more recent weeks around NAFTA, the peso has come back, and also some brave and courageous action on the Central Bank of Mexico, raising rates. The peso has come back, so I'm happy to report that.
I want to add to that statement that politicians, even economists, should not be in business of determining the exchange rate. If it should be high or should be low. The market and market forces, for a good reason, determine the value of our currency compared to other countries. And it's funny, when people are running for the office, they said, well, we should have a strong dollar because that makes us strong. That's a sign of being a strong country. We are a powerful country. Look what is happening to the value of our currency is very high. And the sad part is a lot of people buy it. Even they know it's going to affect negatively their pocketbook. So I want to do a little bit marketing or advertising for CU's economics department and also mine in Vermont. So the best thing to do, again, honestly, got young people take a basic economic class. A basic economic class. I tell the student, when you graduate, you don't write in your resume that you know how to add and subtract, how to read and write. Having a basic knowledge about how economic works, believe me, is as important as when you learn how to add and subtract. And then when a charlatan like me making a statement, you say, oh, I know he's lying, and the noise is getting bigger and bigger.
Okay. The last trade question, and then we'll move on to some other ones. So, and let's be brief on this, but just NAFTA, good or bad for the USA?
It's not good or bad. It's very, very good.
I second that, and there are a lot of, again, evidence, a lot of data to prove it. Yes, we lost some of the jobs. Those are the lowest skilled jobs. Those are the jobs that a lot of people who didn't have a high school degree lost. But again, this is another example that we look at only the negative aspect of the issue, but we also create a lot of a lot of skillful jobs. So I think that's an important. And one thing I think my colleague mentioned from the Fed, that when we import some of this product for Mexico, 40% of it of the U.S. content. So again, we got to be careful if we really impose restriction on Mexico and other countries. Yes, it might create some job, protect some jobs in some industry, but we're going to lose some job, maybe other sector of our economy. So we got to look at the net effect of imposing tariff and quotas.
Yes, I agree that NAFTA has been a net it's been a win-win for the U.S. and for Mexico, certainly. It's been a much bigger deal for Mexico than it has been for the U.S. The U.S. is a giant economy, so the effects on us, certain industries have been large, but on the whole, in terms of our entire GDP, not huge effect. But for Mexico, it's made all the difference in the world. They've been able to modernize their manufacturing industry. Today in Mexico, 30% of formal sector jobs are generated in manufacturing. So it's a huge deal for Mexico, and it's a win for the U.S. Again, in the long term, because initially from free trade agreements, you generate one round of winners and losers before the economy adjusts to the new sort of status quo. An example in NAFTA was in Texas, for example, shortly after NAFTA, and then with CAFTA, and then there was something called the multi-fiber agreement. At the end of all these trade deals, basically, we had a large apparel and textile manufacturing industry in El Paso, Texas, right on the border, and thousands of jobs were lost there. I want to say 30,000, but I'm not sure if I'm remembering that right. Levi's, for example, was a company producing jeans in El Paso, and they eventually closed down all their factories. So all those jobs were lost, and that was because of trade. But of course, in their wake, now El Paso has come back. It was 10 tough years initially, but the city has come back, and now they're all around, growing up businesses around business, trade with Mexico, logistics, transportation, business services. Those types of industries have grown up in the wake of the manufacturing industry that we lost.
Okay, now we'll turn to some issues in international relations, and I'm going to read out both of the questions, and then you guys can respond to them. So the first one is from Logan. Will Donald Trump's policies, and we'll narrow that more to economic policies given this, jeopardize relations with our allies around the world? Please explain how or how not. And then another one that's broader still is, does Trump understand the political economy of international relations? So why don't we start in this direction? We've been kind of going.
I talked about Mexico, and I think that's the perfect example for this person asking the question. I think that we were on a very dangerous trajectory where what we were saying here on this side of the border could have plunged the Mexican economy into a recession. I mean, I think that's how close we got, and just in the sense that Mexico really depends on the U.S. for so much of their business activity. And then I talked earlier about how the peso, their currency depreciated, and then inflation rose, and then all the uncertainty around the economic policies in the United States, what it does is create hesitancy around business investors. So all these investment plans that people had along the border or even within Mexico, those investment plans were put on the shelf, awaiting, resolution of some of the talk coming out of Washington. But I think what we're seeing now is more realism. We're getting some better rhetoric. We're getting more realistic assessments of the trade relationships, and just a better, it seems like there's a better understanding now of how complicated these relationships are, and how we think that if we put a tariff on imports from Mexico, that now we understand a lot of these imports are actually intra-industry imports, and that's like taxing ourselves, because these are the imports that are going into U.S. products, not just for U.S. consumers, but to be exported to the rest of the world.
I think international trade probably can be an effective tool, to maybe reduce the tension among two different countries. And this is my justification. If the two countries are interdependent because of a globalization, because of a trade, and they know their economic well-being depends on each other, then I don't think if there is a misunderstanding or is a conflict between those two countries, they really want to start a war or they want to attack one another, because they know at the end of the day their economy might suffer. So I think it's not really totally wrong to say that there are other advantages for fair and free trade among different countries. Not only there is economic advantage, there also might be a political advantage, and also that might help our immigration problem. Now, as Vito said, if really the NAFTA is helping the economy of Mexico, I think at the end of the day, we as an American policymaker or American people might be the main beneficiary because these people have a decent job in their homeland. They are making a decent salary, so they have no incentive to come to the United States legally or illegally. And I think based on my own experience as an immigrant, I think there is some truth in that statement.
I agree about the points made about Mexico. I think that's a potential problem. May not come to pass, but I think that he could worsen relations there. And the EU, I think, is maybe, minus the potential to have a separate agreement with the UK. The EU states, depending on how they react and what they want to do, I could see the president, tightening up some relationships with them in ways that would be tough for them to handle. Another question is India. And the caveat I have here is that I think the things Trump's going to do will be really antagonistic toward Russia, especially on the energy front. Keeping the world energy prices low has been the utmost annoyance to Vladimir Putin. Personally, I like to keep it that way. I like it when he's ticked off about market forces working against his hegemonic, imperialistic, desires. And then China. And China, I think there's potential there if they decide they don't want to relent in building islands and extending influence in different parts of, not just in East Asia, but maybe even in Africa and elsewhere. Can you simultaneously tick off Russia, China, and India? That's a lot of geography and a lot of people. So I have a feeling that India will end up becoming a beneficiary of whatever we do relative to China and Russia.
Okay, some more on immigration. So let's see. I'm going to put two questions together. Here's a specific one. Canada's immigration policy considers job skills and labor force contributions, while America, the U.S., prioritizes family reunification. How can we consider best paths forward, balancing each for the good of economic prosperity and reality of immigrant lives? Okay, so, and then I'll pony on top of that. What is immigration policy done right?
Okay, I can take a first stab at that. I think so. What I've written I've done some work on immigration policy, and we have a book, my co-author and I, on immigration, on suggestions for immigration reform for the United States, and we certainly emphasize, that Canada is a good example in many cases to follow, just because they do emphasize economics in setting up their immigration policy. They prioritize economic and employment-based immigration over family-based immigration. So I think something like 60% of their permanent visas, those are like green cards, go to economic-based immigrants, whereas in the U.S., it's less than 15%, because the great majority of our green cards go to family-based migrants. And so that's certainly a change that we advocated for in our book. And that's also, to say something positive, there is a bill, I think, in the House, under this administration that's suggesting moving the U.S. system more to an employment-based, skill-based system, kind of like Canada's. The problem with that, what I've seen of that bill, is that it also advocates severely reducing the numbers coming in to the United States. And so that I don't think is, something, we don't need to go there, in the sense, if you think the latest, we're still working off the numbers that were set in 1965. That was really our last major reform of immigration laws. We had another reform in 1990 that increased some of the numbers for employment-based immigrants. But think of how much our economy has grown since then, and our population has grown, and we really haven't made accommodations in the visa numbers for all this growth. So I think you need certainly a change in the skill mix of immigrants, and a change in the emphasis of immigration towards more employment-based, skill-based, but at the same time, you're also going to need more numbers.
I totally agree with that statement. We need a smarter immigration policy. And also, I think we are very generous when we're giving a lot of green card we give a lot of green card to a lot of people, and I think, it might be a good idea we take a few steps back and evaluate what we do, not only with the family that want to come to this country. So it might be a good idea, we give a green card or permanent resident maybe to the wife and a husband and their children, and maybe be a little bit more careful with extended family, for example, the grandparents, the uncles, and other relatives. And there are examples in a lot of places, especially in the state of Maine, that might cause us some economic and social problem when in a small town, a large majority are coming from a particular country, and obviously they create some challenges, both economic and social challenges, for example, for that small community like the school and other small places that they have to provide a lot of service for a lot of people that is going to be very expensive for the native people.
Let me just give more reasons why I agree with both the other panelists, which in and of itself is a dangerous moment in any CWA panel where I'm in agreement with everyone else. So either congratulations or condolences, I'm not sure which. On the key point Pia makes about the family base, and Riza makes it too, is that you have something like 650,000 in the most recent year out of that 1,050,000 who came in. They came in on the basis of some family connection. And the remainder were divided up between asylum and refugees and job-related categories. If the 650,000 number, if you were rethinking this from scratch, I don't think anybody would devise a system with that kind of set of ratios. So what I would suggest is that people think about it. If you took 650 down to zero, it doesn't mean that all those 650 would not come to America. Some would come in because their job skills would fit within some of the needs identified, and they would just be coming in under a different category. Some of them might even be in the category of refugee or asylum status. So it kind of gets back to, I think, a core question, which I had a lot of fun asking people coming through my office when I was on the Hill who wanted to react to different elements of the Senate-passed immigration bill. This is like mid-2013. And I would always pull back because these were experts on some corner of the immigration statutory scheme, right? And they had some specific thing they were asking for. And I'd say, okay, let's go to 30,000 or even 50,000 feet. What's the purpose of having an immigration code for any receiving country? And they never were asked that question. They would look at you like, oh, wow, that's really a good question. And so it caused a lot of us to sit and have these little blue sky discussions. And my shot at it, and I'm perfectly willing to have amendments made to this, but I think the core purposes ought to be serving the economic interests of the receiving country, honoring the humanitarian traditions of that country, and maybe one other thing, maybe something about asking for and getting more indications of assimilation than you would otherwise get. I think assimilation is an important thing to do when you have a country like ours that's really focused and founded on a creed, not some geography or not some ethnicity. So if you redid the code that way, I think you'd end up with a lot more refugee and asylum category. And I think you'd end up with a lot more job category. Maybe multiply it by several of where it is now, maybe 10 or 20. You get 300,000-400,000. A lot of that would be a determination of where the demand is. I had people coming through who were representing all levels of the economic spectrum, from the ag workers to the high-tech workers. And all of them had different kind of concerns and were feeling different kinds of pinches about the current status quo. And the other point I'd make is that a lot of people don't necessarily want to come here, stay here, live here, and become card-carrying Americans, right? They want to get a job for a while, and maybe picking apples or maybe doing something on a seasonal basis is exactly what fits their needs. And we ought to make it really easy and encouraging. There's another category of people, maybe much larger than where we are today, who can come and go, right? It used to be that way a long time ago. That it was simpler to come work, and when you finish up a season ends or whatever, and you can go back home. People don't want to necessarily be separated from families for so long. Some don't want to bring their whole family with them. I mean, you don't want to be separated, so you're stuck with a kind of a Hobson's choice of how to go forward. So I think we could humanize our immigration code in a few different ways. The problem, of course, is that you run into all the politics of it, which we can discuss at some other time. But it's a nasty political environment about what each side has to have first before they can continue on in all the areas where there's a lot of agreement.
Okay. Following up on that is a specific question to Michael. Do you think 1 million or 2 million immigrants over a year time frame is a threat to changing and over 300 million people's culture? Elaborate. You said it was a threat, or is a threat.
No, I say some people think it's a threat at the current number. I think that the short answer is depends upon how we assimilate or not assimilate the folks who come in. Because, like I kind of said earlier, if you don't demand anything on that front, I think you're asking for the creation of ethnic, language, and other kinds of cultural separate, gated type communities in around the country. And I don't think we want that. I think we want to have our immigrants come in and be Americans in some form or another. And that's, to me, a premise behind it. And I don't see that as a threat at all. And if we can get that side of the equation done real well, 1.5, 2.0 million, have at it. I'm the son of an immigrant. I think she did pretty well, if I'm saying so myself. And, I think that I grew up around him. You take him for granted if you live in some of the big cities here. And it's a wonderful addition to our society. And I don't see where, if there's any kind of natural cap, that's getting into kind of Darwinian eugenics or something. I reject that wholeheartedly.
Go ahead.
I don't think one culture is superior to another culture, and if we do it correctly, when the immigrant come to this country, believe it or not, enrich our own culture. And if I may add it, also they're going to improve the diversity of the food we live in this country.
Okay, leave that one alone. Okay, so here's one. So what can be done to compensate workers who are harmed by imports and immigrant workers?
So that's a great question, because I think that's sort of where we need to go next to get these initiatives that are stalled, because now everyone is speaking against these, whether it's immigration or trade. How can we win over the other side, or how can we talk about winners and losers, be honest about winners and losers, and figure out schemes to compensate the losers from trade? And so we do have some things in place, like Trade Adjustment Assistance is a federal program that offers both money and retraining to displaced workers, so there's that. And I think there might be other similar programs to it. We could extend that to immigration. I mean, is there a way that we can identify workers that have been harmed by large inflows of immigrants into their occupations or into their areas, and extend some other, some similar kind of compensatory scheme. I'm not sure I know the details of what this would look like, but it would probably be similar to TA, where it would be a combination of workforce training money. And then there's this other idea out there that one big problem with trade that's come up is, in certain geographic areas, especially where you have smaller towns, medium-sized towns that may be dependent on one plant, one factory, and then that factory moves overseas or shuts down, then this was an issue in the election. And so what do you do with the people then that were left without work in those towns, or have to move into jobs that pay a lot less? Well, the one idea that I've seen written up is offer them money to move. And so the problem that arises there is that people may be hard for them to get, to sell a house if it's a declining geographic area. But if the government could come in and sort of subsidize or absorb those losses so that people can actually move to growing areas, I think that's a new idea, which is exciting.
Yeah, that's the reality of international trade. That's what we'll tell our students when they take an international trade course, that there is a winner and a loser. And that's not a fault of international trade, folks. That's just the reality. But it's government responsibility, as my colleague Pia said, to help people who lost their job or decrease in their income as a trade. And I was saddened, to see how the politicians trashed TPP during the election. And the sad part was a lot of them didn't know what what was in it. I don't think even they look at it because it had a lot of safety net when it comes to the environmental regulation, environmental protection, and honestly to protect a lot of people that might lose their job as a result of this agreement. And for an international economist, I think that was a sad moment for me, to be honest with you. And American people accepted. And again, it wasn't Donald Trump. Mrs. Clinton made the same statement by criticizing her own husband when he helped NAFTA because it was something that politically was very popular at that time.
I'll make 2 quick points. One is I'm a little more skeptical, I think, of the efficacy of the job training program model than PIA might be, but I haven't seen much evidence that they've worked. There's 40 or 50 of them, I think, overall in the federal government, where the TAA is an example of one of those. And when they were evaluated, they tend to fall short. I would throw one idea on the table. There are these licensing laws that affect a really high percentage of the jobs in many parts of the country, where in order to work as the classic example, I guess, is being a hair braider in some city, you have to you get a license that requires a lot of investment of time and money to get trained, and sometimes you don't really, it's sort of unnecessary. It's meant to be a bit of a protectionist type occupational law to prevent some people from getting into a trade. And some of these also, in many cases, even if you do persevere and get a license for one of these jobs, it's hard to move from state to state. You have to go back and start from square one when you move to another state to be able to practice that same trade in that other state. So to the extent that somebody wants to transition from a job in a factory that gets closed or a job in a business that's negatively affected by trade, they may want to move into one of these professions. It ought to be as easy as possible to get into those jobs. They tend to be overly represented by immigrants. And I would make it as simple as possible to get those jobs, get a career up and running in that field, and to move from state to state if necessary in order to continue to practice in that field. So that's just one idea.
Okay. We have about 7 minutes, and I was thinking, we've got a lot of time for this, and I see I have to make tough choices here. The nature of my life. Okay, so what chance do you see of a recession over the next 12 months, and the role of policy with creating or preventing one?
That typical economist answer.
On the one hand?
That depends. I think both consumers and the producer and the stock market, they're looking for some certainty. I think we all want to know if we can trust the person who says, this is my economic plan and this is what I want to do. If we develop that element of trust, that people mean what they say, I don't think there is going to be a danger of a recession the next couple years. And I think based on a statement I have heard the past few days about the decision maker in this country, I'm very optimistic that we're going to avoid the trade war. We're going to reduce hopefully some of the uncertainty, and as long as some of those policymakers leave the economy alone, we're probably going to be in decent shape.
Anyone else?
I think the economy is pretty strong. I mean, the GDP growth has been robust in the last few quarters, and job growth has been about as good as you can expect, given that we have pretty tight labor markets. We have a very low unemployment rate at the moment. So generally, the economy is strong, but there is a lot of uncertainty out there. Policy uncertainty, which is obviously affecting, like we mentioned earlier, business investment decisions, that type of thing. But yeah, even if we look abroad internationally, we're seeing some recovery in the European Union economy. And so, I think it's a pretty bright picture. I would put the chance of recession very low.
The one non-economist observation I'd make is that we've had a lot of months, since June of 2009, of growth, right? Of quarters of growth with a couple of hiccups here and there. And is there I don't necessarily believe in I'm not a determinist believing in cycles as being overwhelming, but at some point, even though the recovery has been weaker than other ones, does that start to give way to a potential for a recession? The other thing I would just say is that a lot of these things that strike me as structural baggage for any economy, like the growing percentage of the workforce that's been on disability, and you tend, once you get on disability, to stay on disability, and that's a fairly high percentage of the working age population. You have your labor force rates, participation rates that are historically quite low, and a lot of these people seem to have ended up dropping out of the workforce, getting into the disability side of the equation. To what extent are those kind of trend lines that we've seen going to continue, and do they kind of create a weight on the ability of future economic growth to be maybe as robust as it used to be? And then the last thing I just ask, and I'm not sure, but it strikes me that I've heard economists talk about what happens if interest rates go back up to some kind of historical norm relative to, for example, the debt. So if you have you're financing $19 trillion of debt at 1%, that's a lot less money per year you're paying in interest than if you're financing that same amount at, say, 3 or 4%. And if you add another $600 billion of interest payments to the federal budget, you're going to create some serious, hiccup is a light word for that. It's going to be some real serious problems, convulsions, I would think. And if you have any reactions to that, I'd love to hear it.
Okay, student. This is from a student. So statement, ecosystem services are roughly valued at $33 trillion a year. So how do you feel about Trump's move to negate environmental regulations for short-term gains?
As someone who teach environmental economics class, I think that's very easy to cut in the short run. And I think people really don't recognize, how much it's going to cost this economy and cost us, honestly, God, in the next few years. I think that's probably is not a right policy, to be very honest with you.
Anybody else? Okay, let's see. We're just about, this is a real big one here. Let's see, where is it? Where did it go? Oh, yes. What is your biggest political fear? Question mark. Honestly, question mark. And that will be the last question.
I think I just go back to my last point about the interest rates, because that seems to be something that, relatively minor movement towards something that we'd been used to for a long time. In other words, the old norm, if it ever were to be achieved, would cause a lot of fiscal angst that I think could trigger a lot of other ripple effects in ways that a non-economist like me can't exactly envision, but it seems like a pretty bad horror movie.
My biggest fear is having dysfunctional government. We have the right, we have the left, we have in the middle, and I think the sad part is we are not acting like an adult. We are barking at one another, and I think, it's about time for us, for the good of the country, put our differences aside, and conservative start to listen to progressive. Progressive start to listen to conservative, because at the end of the day, if we do not put our differences aside and work together, we're all going to suffer. That's my biggest fear.
My biggest really disappointment, and this is with both sides of the political spectrum, is that, and like my colleagues kind of pointed out, the reluctance really to confront the big problems that we face that have to be resolved. And so it was absolutely astounding to me that we could go through an entire presidential campaign and nobody brought up entitlement reform, which is the biggest problem facing us, I think, in terms of not just the debt and the deficit, but just in terms of the demographic change that we're facing. I think, these lawmakers have to be responsible and have to tackle the tough issues, even if they're not politically popular. We have to address these.
Agree with that.
Okay, I have one announcement to make before you all clear out of here. So I'll take my advantage of my chair position. So being you all came to this panel in your interest, the economics department is sponsoring a lecture on Monday night. We've hired a new endowed professor, Miles Kimball, who's a brilliant and interesting guy, and he's going to be giving a lecture on restoring American growth. And so you might be interested in that. It's at 5 p.m. in the let's see, let me make sure I've got this. It's in Benson's building, the Earth Sciences building, so at 5. So I want to thank you all for coming. If you're interested, I brought a few flyers. I want to thank you all for coming. I urge you, as suggested earlier, to go on and give a little money towards the Conference on World Affairs, because it actually comes at quite an expense to the university. And if you enjoy it, I was thinking the next time you think about having a drink or having a coffee, think, well, maybe I should forgo this and just give a few dollars to the Conference on World Affairs. It's a small price to pay to keep it running. So thank you all very much, and we're adjourned.